First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone. This is the MJF kickoff to their annual fall fundraiser. Minnesota Justice Foundation is celebrating its 15th year. It was started by UNM students 15 years ago in an attempt to encourage students to be able to work in the public law arena, and also to now provide lawyers and law firms with avenues to do their pro bono work and to do volunteer work and to generally offer work to people who normally wouldn't be able to afford legal services. So MJF is a really important organization, and I encourage all of you to become members, to support it, even if you have no interest in actually practicing public law. The big crescendo to the fall fundraiser is a week from Friday night at the International Market Center, a big social/political event with dinner, cash bar, evening dress, lots of attorneys coming, lots of students, professors, and the big top off will be an awards ceremony where our own Catherine Webb Stafford is going to receive the Student of the Year Award for public service work. And also then we're going to have a wonderful speech from the dynamic Sister Helen Prejean, who's the author of Dead Man Walking, and we've been showing the videos. There are sign-up tables and ticket sales after this out in the hallway for those of you who haven't got your tickets yet. So really, it's going to be a really great event. All these organizations have helped sponsor today's event. We really want to thank all of them, and I'm not going to go through them all because it's pretty self-explanatory. Let me introduce our speakers. At the far end, we have Keith Ellison, who is the Executive Director of the Legal Rights Center. It's a non-profit legal defender organization that provides legal services and social advocacy for juveniles and adults of low income in Minneapolis. Sandra Babcock is an assistant public defender at Hennepin County. Before that, she worked for 4 years in Texas at the Texas Resource Center, representing death row inmates. While Ms. Babcock, just as a side, was working in Texas, 40 inmates were executed. And drum roll, this is Tony Boza. He was our former Minneapolis chief of police and is now retired. We're very grateful that he's interrupted his busy Midwest East Coast schedule to be with us. Thank you for that. In 1994, some of you that lived here might remember that he ran for the DFL party nomination for governor, and he has just written a wonderful book which I'm going to pass around titled The Decline and Fall of the American Empire: Corruption, Decadence, and the American Dream. So, everyone rush out to buy a copy of the book and go and pass it around now. The order of the discussion will simply be for each of the speakers to give about 7 minutes or so, 8 minutes of their own personal view on the death penalty. I'll let you figure out who's for and who's against. And then we're going to open up the floor to questions. If you have a question that you wish all of them to answer, please specify that, and then if you have one that you want directed at one particular person, please specify that. And if it's questions for everybody, they'll each have about 1 or 2 minutes to answer, and then I'll flag everyone. And then I'll shut up and sit down. So go ahead, Keith.
Well, thank you very much, Paula. I'd like to thank all of you for inviting us to be here to discuss this very important topic. I'm of the mind that students play a critical and essential role in helping the rest of society formulate and debate. Oftentimes you can't go into court unless you're a student attorney. But one of the things you can do that we all kind of depend upon you to do is to create environments like this so we can kick the death penalty around. The CIA crack thing, I hope y'all have a forum on that. I'd love to talk about that. Future ideas. and other issues like that. So thank you again. I thank you for doing your duty, because people don't often do it, but I do regard this as something that students should do, and I appreciate what people do for themselves. And also thank you to everyone who is in these organizations and everybody else who helped to bring this off, because this is a critically important issue. I'm impressed by the title, The Decline and Fall of the American Empire, because I think it's something we all need to talk about. And I'm sure that people have different ideas as to why the American empire is declining and falling. I would submit to you that it's because of injustice, essentially racial injustice. And I think that there is no place where racial injustice expresses itself more fully than in the death penalty. I think that if we can correct America and make it a good place, because it hasn't been for people of color, I think that we could perhaps avert this fall, this decline that Mr. Bozo writes about. I think that there's no society that has ever existed that in some way cannot trace the roots of its fall to some fundamental contradiction with the espoused principles of that society. What do I mean? You can't say we the people and have slavery at the same time. You can't say that we are a country of democratic law, yet have a situation where 40+% of the people on death row are people from historically oppressed, from the black community. I would venture to say nearly half from oppressed nationalities. The roots of the decline of this country have to do with what W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1909, and that is the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. When I think about the death penalty, I think about that biblical verse that has to do with sacrificing the goat. You know, the priest will take the sins of the community and pray that all of the sins of the community will be deposited within this goat. And then that goat will be sacrificed. And through that sacrifice, we hope that all of our sins, all of our fears, all of our irrational strivings are somehow sent into that animal, and then we kill that thing. In so doing, we haven't changed ourselves much, but what we've done is made ourselves feel a little bit better, because psychologically we've made ourselves believe that we've somehow cleansed ourselves of the problem. This is exactly the role that the death penalty plays. Why do I say this? First of all, the death penalty works exactly like every other institution in society that is racially biased. And it doesn't do any of the things that it proclaims to do. The death penalty is irrationally administered, racially biased, and the death penalty, more than anything else, serves as a way where we can somehow vindicate what we view to be the wrongs in society. With the death penalty, and I am against the death penalty, you probably already figured out. but people like Susan Smith, a woman who strapped her 2 small babies into a car and then allowed them to slowly be drowned, as you no doubt know they screamed for none other than her to save them. She doesn't get the death penalty. Yet Mumia Abu-Jamal, a man who very likely is innocent, he gets the death penalty. A man like Jeffrey Dahmer, and I know Wisconsin doesn't have a death penalty, but a man like Jeffrey Dahmer, we don't see the hue and the cry and great public mandate for the death penalty for Jeffrey Dahmer in the world. But I have a book here that talks about the ordeal of 400 Americans wrongly convicted of crimes punishable by death. 400. There's a whole section on race in here. My point is that this question of race and racism, it's like this. America has always had a deep and abiding fear of black people and others of color as well. There's an excellent book out called The American Negro Slave Revolts that talks all about how during the pre-Civil War era of this country, it was not an area of comfort, particularly for white Southerners. They lived in constant fear and they lived in constant suspicion because they believed that every person on their plantation in slavery was constantly conspiring, from the house workers to the people in the field, to overthrow and upset them. They made people taste their food because they were afraid that the women working in the kitchen would ground up glass in their food. And of course, they're afraid of the ones who work with the machetes cutting sugarcane out there. And this fear led to some of the most gruesome torture that you could possibly imagine. This fear. One of the other fears was not just black people, but black people as it relates to hurting whites, and particularly interaction with white women. Very intense fear. And what we find when we look at the death penalty, we look at it statistically. And there's an excellent statistical study that was written about in the case McCluskey v. Camp, the Baldwin study. It talks about how this racial hysteria and this legacy of racism is transferred into the death penalty. Let me tell you, what the study showed, and I won't recite the entire study, but I'll just let you know a few things. It says that defendants who were convicted of killing whites are 4.3 times more likely to get the death penalty than defendants killing blacks. What is the message here? You tell me. The black life is worth less. Obviously. What else? 6 of every 11 defendants convicted of killing a white person would not have received the death penalty if they had killed somebody black. Okay? This is what the Baldwin study showed. Now you might think, okay, obviously the Supreme Court is going to subject this to rigorous inquiry. And obviously, if there's any faults in this study, they'll be unearthed by our very, very keen and perceptive justices of the United States Supreme Court. But what we find is that they say they pass on the validity of the study. They say, okay, let's just say what you're saying is right. We'll go along with that. But Justice Powell put it, I believe, best. He said, McCluskey's claim, taken to its logical conclusion, throws into serious questions the principles that underlie our entire criminal justice system. It makes you ask the question, what are the foundations of the entire criminal justice system? You can answer that for yourself. So we've got 1 more minute to go. But I just want you to know that the death penalty is wrong for a lot of reasons. Well, one of them is that it serves as not a method of distributing justice, but as a method of racial control of populations whom the power for people with racial privilege feel. And I urge you, if you do want to see America not decline and not fall, that you insist on justice every time, because let me tell you, it's not a threat, it's just it's axiomatic truth that injustice breeds resistance, and that where there's no justice, there must be a response that is chaotic, and somehow people don't appreciate it, but that response, it goes hand in hand with the process of creating and striving for a just society. So I hope that you will re-examine your views on the death penalty. If you believe in it, if you don't, I hope you'll strengthen and deepen your understanding as to why it's wrong. Thank you very much.
It's always hard to have a speech prepared for something like this because I hear Keith and I want to say all of these things now and all my thoughts are jumbled up. Also because I worked with people in death row for 4 years and I knew many of them. And I had such strong feelings about this issue, and it's also not hard for you to determine. I'm also opposed to the death penalty. Politicians and others have seized upon the death penalty. Politicians around the country, not as much here in Minnesota, but in the South, in the Death Belt states, and now in New England and New York, as a symbol of their willingness to be tough on crime, and as an indication of their desire to exact the highest penalty, the highest retribution on behalf of innocent crime victims. This rhetoric of revenge and retribution strikes a chord with many people. And the reason it does is because many people now feel helpless in the face of rising crime rates. They feel frustrated, they feel angry, and they're fearful. And they throw up their hands and they say, well, what else can we do? We've tried everything. And we know that criminals get out on the streets and they don't really serve the sentences that they're given. And we know that people are committing more and more crimes, and we know that they're committing more violent crimes. So what else can we do but impose the death penalty?
in years in which the death penalty has been administered and implemented in the states of the Death Belt, in the states like California, and Washington, and now New York. Second, it elevates this concern with crime victims and the harm done to crime victims by violent crimes. There's nobody who's going to dispute that. It elevates that over the other aspects of the criminal justice system that are important and even critical for us to consider. Deterrence, rehabilitation, justice, fairness, equality. I think there's one other thing that this argument seizes upon and misconstrues, and I think that many people who support the death penalty do this out of ignorance. They seize upon this symbolic imagery of someone like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, and they say these people are evil. They're evil personified, and we need to eliminate them. Because what good would it do us as a society to have these kind of people living among us, even if they're living in prison? The fact of the matter is, the people who are on death row in states like Texas and states like California are not Jeffrey Dahmers, and they're not Ted Bundys for the most part, although there are, I imagine, some serial killers on death row across the country. The people who are in death row in Texas and the people that I met are some of the most impaired, savaged people that I've ever met in my life. They suffer from brain damage. They suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome that developed when their mothers drank vast quantities of alcohol while they were pregnant. They've been sexually abused in horrible ways. They're mentally retarded. Some of them were juveniles when they committed their crimes. And I'll tell you the average type of crime, or the average profile of a crime that leads to a death sentence in Texas. It's a convenience store robbery. Convenience store robbery that leads to murder. Now, that's not saying that that's not a horrible violent crime. But many people, when they think about who's on death row and what got them to death row, they assume that these are the worst of the worst. That these are not just your everyday murders, they're just the really evil, horrible murders. And it seems funny to talk about murder and to distinguish among them like that. And many of you will probably reject that idea. But it is true that our criminal justice system distinguishes among levels of culpability. And there are certain things that we need to take into account, and one is the harm done to the victim, the manner in which that harm was perpetrated, and also at the same time, the criminal justice system considers the personal blameworthiness of the defendant. Now, the death penalty is racist in application. It is costly. It costs far more than life without parole. And is arbitrary in those it targets for execution. Just briefly, I think that if I don't address it fully now, I'll address it later, because I think that it always comes down to this. Every argument that you can make about the death penalty, and I think that as a practical matter, the death penalty doesn't work. But I really think the force behind the arguments of many people who are opposed to the death penalty is a moral one. And that is that the death penalty is fundamentally dehumanizing and degrading to us as a society. And it sets apart these people as beyond redemption, as people that we've turned our back upon, and we can never rescue them. And I think that says something about us as a society and our willingness to see the worst in people. And with that, I guess I'll leave it up to you.
Very Minnesotan, the seats are empty, please sit. I've been giving speeches in Minnesota for 17 years, and the front row seats are We're not taking any collection today. Myself, when young, did eagerly frequent Doctor and Saint and heard great argument about it and about. It evermore came out the same door where the Lord went. So I don't know that I'm going to convince anyone here of the rightness of the state taking human life, killing other humans. This goes to the question of the nature of man, Homo sapien, man who lives, visibly exterminating the Neanderthals across Europe. It's obviously a very desperate and cruel measure to kill, and we're talking about human beings killing other human beings under the sanction of the state, which I support. We're talking about the nature of man. I do not think man is inherently evil, or the human animal. I don't think he is inherently good. I think he is malleable and shaped by circumstance and by appetites and by opportunities. And looking at somebody in death row is quite different from watching them or standing over some helpless young woman, as Ted Bundy did so many times, and working his will on her. Ted Bundy is a different creature in the cell, and if you can tell me that he's going to be there forever, there might be a persuasive argument, but they escape, they get out, and it's the history of serial killers that they're out all the time. That they come out, they escape, they get out. The U.S. Constitution clearly permits you shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or property except under due process of law. That means that the founding parents obviously foresaw the necessity to take life, to take property, and to take liberty under the due process of law. It is administered imperfectly. As all of the human activities, and I'm sure Boris Yeltsin could speak to floor the human actions, and the dangers inherent therein. It's an imperfect world, and it is administered imperfectly, and it does happen. I do want to thank Mr. Ellison just parenthetically for two things. One, for mentioning the book, also thank you, and so lavishly, and for mentioning a very important figure in American history, who I think tends to be ignored, W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I mentioned in my book, and whose works you should be familiar with, because he represents a very important body of thought in America. Does it deter? Does the death penalty deter? I think clearly the answer is logically yes. Or even though there are statistical studies that demonstrate that in a population of 21,000 annual murders in America, the imposition of the death penalty in one state and the lack of it in another doesn't affect the overall totals. It doesn't. It's a small number within that number. But to say that it deters or doesn't deter is to say that human behavior cannot be controlled by punishment. Of course it can be. There are only two real ways to control human behavior: rewards and punishments, encouragement, education, housing, welfare, benefits, jobs, love, nurturing, and killing, punishing, whacking, and we're in the business of trying to control human behavior. And how do you, the execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, you could argue as to whether he was guilty or innocent. I believe he was guilty. The execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann eliminated kidnappings of babies in America. For the 9 years that I was chief of police in Minneapolis, there was not one single child kidnapped by a stranger. Not one. This has been the truth of America for over 60 years. Deterrence works. Rewards work. It's absurd to think it does not. We can prevent a lot of homicides, but through a variety of programs. The crimes that the death penalty seeks to prevent are crimes that require premeditation, deliberation, planning, serial killing, the killing of children, the assassination of public figures, the employment of terror, things of that nature, not the barroom brawls or the domestic abuses. Domestic abuse, homicides, which are a great number of the homicides of women, and we're talking about men here, because the violence in our society is perpetrated by the men. When you're talking about domestic abuse, frequently the begins with a shout, a slap, or yelling, pushing, kicking, punching, murder. It ends in murder. If you don't interrupt that cycle, if you don't arrest the batterer, put him into treatment, deal with his alcoholism and drug addiction, and separate the women and the children from it, it escalates into murder. So you want to prevent homicides? One way to prevent them is to arrest batterers and intervene in domestic abuse. Another way is to execute serial killers. Susan Smith gave the whole question of capital punishment a very bad name. The notion that the prosecutor would seek to execute a pathetic young woman who had been, in the month before her killing of her 2 babies, had had sex with her ex-husband, his father, her boyfriend, and his father, exploited by 4 predatory males who shamefacedly had to testify to that effect in a trial. And then she pathetically tries to solve her problems and kills her babies. That's not a fit subject for capital punishment. Neither is with the O.J. Simpson case, which, if he had been found guilty, which he was not guilty of, as to his innocence, I will not speak. But that would not have been a usual case. Racism, yes. Is ours a racist society? Absolutely. It exists everywhere. In this room, in a courtroom, in corporate halls, in Texaco's boardrooms, it exists everywhere. Racism is out, and so to say that it is applied in capital punishment is to say nothing. Of course it is. And also economics. The poor don't do as well in our courtrooms as the rich. I once publicly said and wrote, and I've written on the subject many times, the best way to give capital punishment a better name is to execute a few white, fat bankers. How do you deal with the Unabomber, the Oklahoma City case, terrorism? Today's Tribune, there's a story of a man who is busily killing judges and mailing bombs to them because he doesn't like their rulings. How do you prevent that kind of society? A deterrent acts upon those who are observing and weighing it in balance, who are weighing the balance, who are saying, calculating and saying, what do I lose, what do I gain? You know, I grew up watching American movies where people say, we'll get the chair for this. That understood, implied an understanding that there were consequences. The problem with the liberal view, clearly Mr. Ellison and Ms. Babcock have the high moral ground. The problem is that it doesn't take into account consequences, accountability, individual responsibility. How do you impact the behavior of the onlookers? And John Wayne Gacy was executed. And Ted Bundy, who cited here, was executed. And American women are safer today because they were executed. And the one statistical certitude that applies across the board, all the analyses and all of the studies and the statistical reports, executed murderers don't recidivate. That cannot be all the other studies are nonsense because we're talking about an overall picture. Who would be executed? 1 minute. Thank you. People over 18, mentally competent, premeditation, deliberation, public assassination, attempt to reduce terrorism, the kidnappings of babies, serial killers, calculated issues. There ought to be 2 verdicts. You ought to be able to prove guilt beyond the shadow of a doubt to reduce the possibility of error, which is inherent in any human process, and prove guilt in a separate hearing beyond a shadow of a doubt before an individual is executed. 1 professionally prepared appeal, execution within a year of sentence. It is inefficient, it is imperfect, it is racist, it is economically unjust. That's what our society is, and to attempt to bring the argument of perfection into the issue of capital punishment would be and exclude it from every other consequence of our society is a logical absurdity. Of course racism exists and economic inequities exist in capital punishment as everywhere else. We need to work to perfect it, but some human animals need to be killed. Thank you.
Chomping at the bit to respond to Mr. Bose, but we won't let them.
Ellison's points about that capital punishment is disproportionately applied to blacks. That being the case, if we could perfect the system, so to speak, or reach a level where it was not disproportionately applied to any particular economic status or racial status, if we could achieve that level, then would you support it? And if the answer is no, then I mean, how much weight does that argument factor in to determining whether we should have capital punishment as a social policy?
Oh, first of all, I'm against capital punishment as a matter of principle. So, yes, in fact, even if you could, in America, after 310 years of slavery, 100 and some years of Jim Crow, and 30 plus some years of neo-Jim Crow, somehow get rid of racism, right? That's what you're saying we're going to do. I still would be against the death penalty. Let me just say this. Mr. Bowles was right. Executed murders don't recidivate. But executed innocent people don't get appeals, don't get released. Okay? Obviously, racism, evil thing. Anybody here to speak up for racism? Not me, you know. The point of it is that the people in Texaco, Mr. Bosa, the Texaco executives, hopefully will pay dearly, and the victims of that racism will be compensated. Maybe they'll never be made whole given the humiliation and pain of being victimized by racism. But at least they will have a remedy, okay? Racism in our society is wrong, but but with a just legal system, which we all can strive for and continually perfect, you can get remedies to victims of it. But that is not the case when it comes to the death penalty.
Yes.
This is a question for Ms. Babcock. You said that what the death penalty does is suggest that there's a portion of our society that can't be rehabilitated, that we can throw away. Doesn't life imprisonment without parole suggest the same thing?
No, I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because I knew many people on death row, as funny as this might sound, who were leading productive lives. I know one person on death row who is an artist and a writer. I know one of my clients, whose case is now pending before the Supreme Court, is an artisan, and he makes boxes and clocks out of matchsticks and popsicle sticks that he dyes with coffee and tea. He uses a razor blade to do that. He's given a razor blade to do that. He's been on death row for 20 years and has never had any disciplinary actions taken against him because he's been a model prisoner. That's obviously not the case for everybody, and I have to say that I only support life without parole as an alternative to the death penalty. And public support for the death penalty does fall below 50% if people are thinking the alternative of life without parole, and just cut that sentence off right there. But also, if you think about other alternatives, sentencing alternatives such as compensating crime victims, giving them some kind of monetary compensation, and drawing that out of prison labor, for example, that would also be an alternative to the death penalty, but I think it's already considered. Thank you.
Oh, Professor Fellows.
Well, I was going to follow up on the first question, and either anyone on the panel, Dad's question about would we have the death penalty, or would we understand the death penalty like we do without racism? To turn that question around, could we conceive of how we're operating under the death penalty system if it weren't for racism? So,
Would you like that to be answered by each person or
whoever.
So the question is, how would we do it if
question that was asked was, if you could get rid of the racism, would you still support the death penalty? And to me, that raises the issue of, would there be a death penalty but for racism?
You know, I hope that some people from the Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights are here. Is anybody here or Amnesty International? Anybody, any hands can go up from that group? You guys support the program, somebody must be here. Give them a little, okay, yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting, Professor, because the United States is one of the few industrialized countries that have it. And South Africa was, of course, big in that as well. But, you know, what we see is the countries that do not have this long history, you know, their industrialized countries don't have this long history of racial subordination. Somehow they can do without the death penalty. How does America do it? For the reasons that I feel like I've already put forward, that it functions not as a means of distributed justice, but as a whole in which we can put all of our fears, anxieties about issues of the dark other. And so I don't think that I think that America would abandon its attachment to death penalty, but for the racial legacy that we all share.
I have a question for Mr. Boza. Working on the premise usually in law enforcement that someone commits a crime because they don't think they're going to get caught. How do you then explain the death penalty as deterrence? I mean, most people act because they think I can get away with this. No one's going to catch me. No one's going to see me. There's no reason, you know, they're working on that premise in the first place. So how do you then say that the death penalty is a deterrent?
I think people act logically and they weigh the costs and losses and the pain and gain. And if you weigh into that factor the possibility of yourself being killed, I think in any crime that requires premeditation, deliberation, planning, and preparation, that suddenly becomes another weight on the scale of influencing human behavior. I do think the execution of Hoffman, whatever the merits of the case, deterred onlookers. How do you influence the behavior of onlookers who are waiting? The Unabomber, the Oklahoma City killing, the Judge case today. Briefly, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I want to correct Mr. Ellison. The first slave ship arrived in America in Jamestown, Virginia in August of 1619, and slavery ended in 1863. It's 244 years, 100 years of Jim Crowism, of grinding shaft of legal light relating to equality, followed by a series of inequalities, and now back where we started, is not for slavery, but for dependence. Some victims are more important than others, just as some people are more important than others in our society. Rich white victims in America are more important than poor black victims in America. And Mr. Ellison is completely right. I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to try to help find our way to the truth. And when something was said that is true, I think it ought to be supported. We do live in a racist society. We live in a society that makes criminal behavior by blacks almost inevitable because of the circumstances of isolation, unemployment, inadequate housing, ghettoization, alcoholism, drug addiction, the proliferation of drugs in the ghetto, and then crime becomes the inevitable concomitant of black life in America. So the majority of street crimes in America are committed by blacks. That is a statistical reality. So, and since we only incarcerate in the main people who commit street crimes, the reality is that our prisons and our death rows reflect that truth. Currently, there are about 45–46% of our inmates in death row are black males, who represent about 6% of the American population. So they're disproportionately represented there because of the conditions of life that whites have imposed upon them. And the U.S. is virtually alone in its employment of the death penalty. Other countries are fooling around with it and attempted to return. Belgium is currently going through a crisis and so on. But Ms. Babcock is going to have to be corrected on the polling issue. you all know that a lot has to do with how the opponent is worded. If you just say, do you favor capital punishment or do you oppose it, between 70 and 75% of Americans say yes. They support it.
Would you like to respond?
No, you didn't say that was the case, but you omitted any reference to it. You cited a statistic that was clearly unfair. That is that if you worded that we're going to shoot them into outer space and we'll never see them again, people, 60% would say, well, why not?
Should we go to another
This is
question?
young woman.
I would
I'm
like
just
to
giving you a
just,
chance to
I just like to say, I think we might have a difference of opinion as to when black people arrived in American slavery. The date that I operate on is 1555. There are records that you can find in the Congressional Library archives where a slaver named John Hawkins deposited a number of Africans in slavery on the banks of Virginia. And I know this is different from 1619, which I will talk to, but I believe that's the only state. Yeah, and then, let me just say this too. It may or may not be true that this is another problem with death penalty. It may or may not be true that the majority of street crimes are committed by blacks. I doubt whether that's true. I think that most people arrested for street crimes are blacks. Most people definitely for killing people or something like that or involved in street crimes are blacks. But let me say this. Street crimes aren't the worst kind of crimes in the society we live in. What about environmental crime? A company can put a toxic substance into the air that literally kills millions. Nobody does 10 minutes. Maybe they go to Rochester, really. I mean, if killing people, if the number of people you kill, and even planning, is the measure for who gets the death penalty, there's a whole range of crimes we don't even really consider that bad. Because the people who do them wear suits and they're distanced from the victims. There's a lot of things that happen that are very bad things that kill a lot of people that aren't even crimes. What about making cigarettes? They kill a lot of people, don't they? Nobody's full of more cigarettes. Yeah.
Thank you. Did you want to say anything?
Just briefly about insurance, since that's what we asked about. No question the death penalty is a specific deterrent, but the more important thing is whether it's a general deterrent. And there is no study that confirms the death penalty is a general deterrent. In fact, the New York Times published an article, this is from 1994, and I believe it's changed since then, that confirms that in the states that use the death penalty most regularly, their murder rate continues to be higher than the national average, which indicates the death penalty isn't doing what it's supposed to be.
Thank you. Yes, Steve.
I have two comments for Mr. Boza and then a question. I think that to say that we have racism and injustice and economic disparities in society is no different from the death penalty is not a valid or even a relevant argument, because the difference is if I go into an employer and I apply for a job and I'm discriminated against, I can go back out and I can apply for a job. When you kill a black person based on racism, they can't go out and apply for a life again. And then I have a second comment about this idea that Susan Smith, this white woman, is more pathetic a person than a 16-year-old black child on death row in Texas who can barely read, who's been sexually abused, who's been in a juvenile delinquent detention for most of his life. I don't see how you can make, well, that just shows these judgments that we make in society, that this white woman is valued more than this young black child is who's on death row. So my question is actually, what do any of you feel about the juvenile death penalty? But I just had to
What I did, I will, in fairness, I'm used to not being totally heard, but I did say that no one under 18 would be executed. I did say that.
They
Over
are
18.
current. I'm asking.
No, I know that. I said in my proposal,
Mhm.
it would be over 18.
I understand. I just want to know what your view, what everyone else's view is on the juvenile death penalty as it stands now. We know about the Supreme Court that a 16 and 17-year-old can be executed, and so I just want to know what your views are on the juvenile death penalty.
I oppose it over 18.
So just wait
behind the commission of the crime and executing them.
I think it's wrong.
It's wrong, and you're absolutely right. The reason people heard about Susan Smith is because the most wonderful lawyer that I know represented her, and that's David Crawford. Whereas most people in the South, most people who are on death row, got shit for legal representation. Chris?
Part of the argument, Mr. Boza, I think, is utilitarian in nature. That at a certain point, we come to the conclusion that even if Mr. Bundy could make something akin to arts and crafts, his value is pretty small, and we might as well get rid of him, and of course he won't kill again. But I'm definitely playing devil's advocate with myself, but why stop with the Bundys? Why not go right down and get to the heart of the violence in society and make a clear statement to battering males that it's over?
Because if you make a punishment that is disproportionate to the crime, you negate its efficacy. The value of capital punishment lies in a narrow and specific application to the behavior you're trying to influence. And my view is utilitarian. That which requires premeditation, deliberation, preparation, and planning. Ironically, the president's much valued 1994 crime bill contained 46 additional capital punishments. I think the most important election outside of Clinton's yesterday was Paul Wellstone. I love Paul Wellstone. He's a wonderful senator, and I agree with him on almost everything. He voted for that bill, and I would have voted against it because it greatly broadened the reach of capital punishment disproportionately and irrelevantly and maliciously, in my opinion. So I would have voted against it, and he voted, and I begged him to vote against it, but he voted for it for political reasons that have little to do, and because it contained a $1.5 billion domestic abuse proposal that his wife Sheila was interested in, and not wasn't for But I simply want you to recognize that there is a sort of, I have been consistent on this issue, and there is a sort of hypocrisy. There are plenty of people. There is no greater opponent in the state of Minnesota, capital punishment, than Paul Wellstone, and he voted for 46 additional provisions of capital punishment.
Yeah, Mr. Ellison, to assume that the death penalty is racist, just for the sake of this conversation, let's assume it's racist, then I would assume you'd also say life without parole. If we ended the death penalty tomorrow, it's natural to assume that more blacks would be in jail with life without parole than whites, right? I would assume that's logical. If the top penalty now is the death penalty, if the top penalty tomorrow was life without parole, then more blacks would be in jail with life without parole than whites. Is that a valid assumption?
Are you trying to get me to adopt your position so you can ask me another question?
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't you just answer your
Okay, then my second question, if that's yes, then we're assuming that the entire system is racist, and I'm asking specifically how you want to change the system to not make it racist. It's real easy to say something's racist, but I want a specific way to change it to not make it racist.
Well, you know, I'd like to be here for another hour. But in reality, obviously for America is two different places for blacks and whites. It's two different places altogether. I think that we do need to deal with the whole subject of racial reconciliation, racial atonement. In my view, if we can start by white people in America taking responsibility for racial oppression, as opposed to every young person I meet saying, "Oh, I never owned slaves, not me." We can start there, and we can move on to reparations. We can move on to having a election sort of like there was in Canada, where there was an autonomous zone. People decided whether they wanted to have it or not. I think black people should have the right to secede from America if they want to, and if they want to stay here, it should be on grounds of total equality. I mean, what you're asking me is a good question, and I like it. It's fascinating, but I think that we're right on the edge of this conversation and going to another entirely different one. So I'd be happy to talk with you about it after. Thank you. But I think some of the things I said hopefully will get the ball rolling.
Thank you.
This is Mr. Bolza. Given all the problems that you recognize and that the other panelists recognize in the application of the death penalty, I guess I don't really understand your position as to what it's good for. What would happen if we got rid of it tomorrow? Would murder suddenly skyrocket?
I think it's a way of controlling human behavior and impacting the calculations of individuals who plan Unabomber, Oklahoma City bombing, terror, the employment of terror, city attorney. But there is a point here that I cannot ignore and that I insist on coming back to. Race absolutely is central to this. I said that whites have created a society in which black street criminality becomes inevitable. The behavior is shaped by a cruel and oppressive white society. As the blacks suffer horrible cruelties in our society, and part of the expression of that oppression is rioting, occasional rioting in St. Petersburg because of cruelties and injustices, Rodney King, and street crimes, and his unwillingness to debate the question of whether blacks commit the majority of street crimes in America or not is central to our discussion here today, because in my opinion, blacks not confronting that issue lets the whites off the hook. And we can all sit back and say, well, there you are. They don't. It's just Moses crazy racism that blacks commit the majority of street crimes. They do, and we have to find out why. And they do because of white oppression, because of ghettoization, economic inequality. I support affirmative action. I think the Californians were wrong to suspend the rules of fairness and open the doors to black men and women in America makes perfect sense for 5 years.
Go there and get one more question from you.
Mr. Bolzer, could you explain to me how the state deters an act by engaging in that act?
Helpman, by creating an example, the state punishes, rewards, and we influence human behavior by punishments and rewards.
Would anyone like to ask Sandra a quick question? I'll take you and that's it.
Whatever my name is.
About your argument about different first of all, I'm just measurement will have that the odds of a black male being killed at age 25 on the street is something like 25%. If your chances of dying before you're 25 is 1 out of 4, I think, doesn't it seem like your odds of also being killed by a black male are much smaller? So that's part of it. And then the other thing is you said yourself in your opening statement that inevitably based on the social conditions of blacks, inevitably they will commit crime. And in saying that, it seems like you avoid your argument about deterrence and about controlling human behavior. It seems instead what you should do, rather than just killing people because of their social conditions, which inevitably drive them to crime, it seems like we should be held to remedy those social conditions.
Absolutely, both. Individual responsibility, accountability, consequence. We ought to create a justice society that provides economic, racial, and social justice and punishes those who act out. We are dealing with an imperfect society, and we're dealing with America as it exists, and how do you control the behavior that you're confronted with. And I insist that the state have a panoply of opportunities available to it to punish. It also ought to be rewarding and with welfare programs and housing and employment and affirmative action. But it doesn't. That's because the American people don't want it. Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Okay, and speaking of which,
One thing that we haven't addressed, when we're talking about who commits more street crimes, blacks versus whites, that's not the issue here. The issue is who is on death row and who is being executed for crimes, for homicides. And this is a truth, this is a general truth, and I don't think anybody up here is going to assert it. Most homicides are intraracial, meaning they're black on black or white on white. Nobody here has talked about homicide rates and the number of white people who are committing homicides. And we know that, as far as I know, only one white person has been executed in the modern death penalty era for killing a black person. Most of the people of color on death row are there because they killed whites. And that is not an accurate reflection of what we know about the way homicide is committed in this country. The one other point that I wanted to make about control, because this is something we keep hearing, behavior control, it presumes that the people who are committing homicides are just like you and me, that they can reason, that they are whole, that they are not brain damaged, that they are not paranoid schizophrenic, that they have this ability to know what the law is and know what the consequences of their behavior are going to be. That just is not the case. People who commit violent crimes, by and large, do not reflect before they act. So that is a faulty conclusion based on the erroneous assumption. Thank you, everybody.
I don't know what to do, what degree, like what kind of intensity is there. I don't know that. It's difficult to collect that data. But I think that to unjust discrimination, it would be a horrible thing and be to err like any other way. And so there needs to be people out there.